Welcome to another episode of Photoshop CC, the complete guide. We're in week 2, and here are our sessions for this week. Today, we're darn near halfway done. Not quite, but darn near half done with our full month of exploring Photoshop. And today's topic is blending modes. Blending modes is a menu we'll find in Photoshop in many different areas that has choices like screen, multiply, hard light, soft light, just a long list of different blending modes. That's what we're going to explore. So let's jump into Photoshop so we can spend as much time as is practical learning how to use this great feature. And the blending mode menu, as I've mentioned, is in many different areas of Photoshop. So let's first take a look at where we might find it. And then we'll start exploring what it can be used for. And it's really almost infinite what you can do with it. So we can only scratch the surface here, but I want to try to give you a pretty good foundation and knowledge about it so that you can feel comfortable using it anytime you need to. So the first place that you're going to find it is if you're in any painting tool. In your painting tool, if you were to go to the top of your screen in the options bar, right here is a little pop-up menu that's usually set to normal, and that's your blending modes. If you click there, you'll find a long list of choices, and these choices determine how the brush you're about to paint with will interact with the layer you're painting on. Like, how will it interact with what's already on that layer? You'll also find the same menu at the top of your Layers panel, right up here. And if I click there, we'll find these same choices available, and this controls how does the entirety of the contents of this layer interact with the layers that are under it. Like, is there some way that it analyzes those layers underneath and does something special with them? You're going to find it in many other areas. You're going to try to fill something, and you probably find it. You might be in a filter and find it, or other tools. It's throughout Photoshop. But we're going to concentrate on using it just with our layers to keep things simple. And let's take a look at what we can do. First, I'm just going to choose a brush and make sure it has a soft edge. And let's show you what it would usually look like when I paint with this brush. Oh, I'm going to get a normal brush here. I'll get one with a nice soft edge. Take me a moment to get into the normal ones. There we go. And with a normal soft edge brush, this is what you get. Well, I'm going to change the blending mode of this layer, and it's going to make it so that that paint is going to act differently. So before I do this, since I'm going to do it on its own layer, I'm going to create a brand new empty layer to put my paint on. So that's what I have right here, empty layer. I'm just going to paint a few strokes, and then I'm going to change the blending mode to the first choice. It's called Dissolve. What Dissolve is going to do is it's going to take the contents of this layer in any area where it's partially see-through. It won't be able to be see-through at all. It's either going to make the layer so it completely shows up, where it's completely opaque, it completely obscures your view of what's underneath, or completely disappears, and it can't have anything in between. So it's still going to have to simulate the look of this edge fading out, though, and it's going to do it by making it dissolve out. Do you see how now, if I were to zoom up, we have only solid colored pixels that are in there. Zoom up here so you can see the whole thing. And so we're still trying to simulate that look of it fading out, but we're doing it using pixels that are completely showing up or completely disappearing. And that's what Dissolve does. Now, Dissolve is the blending mode that I use the least. Like, I use that once every 10 years, that kind of thing. But there are some interesting uses for it. I'll give you a tip about it, and that is if you end up doing things like lowering the opacity of the entire layer, usually that would make the contents of the layer show up less and less. And in this case, it's going to dissolve out. So it becomes more and more speckly like that. But the problem is that if we tried to do something to this layer, like apply a filter to it or anything else, it does the filtering first, and then it applies it in dissolve mode. If you want this to be there on a more permanent basis, where it's not just an effect attached to that layer. Instead, it's actually these as if you painted in every little one of those specks. What you can do is create a brand new layer, put it underneath, and then take this layer and just say merge down, meaning combine these two layers together. And when it does, it has to maintain the same look that we have here, but it's going to do it on a layer that doesn't have a blending mode. So just watch. I'll choose layer, merge down, and now we have the exact same look, but if you look over here, it's in normal mode, which means this does not contain partially transparent pixels that just have a mode attached to it. Instead, it actually deleted those parts where the pixels aren't showing up. And therefore, I can do things like come over here and maybe I want to do a motion blur to make it so there. Here I'm running a filter called motion blur so that I can take those pixels and kind of spread them out horizontally. I wouldn't be able to do that if that was on the original layer, because the original layer doing a motion blur would just make the edges the tiniest bit softer, but it would look pretty much exactly the same as the original because of that mode. But let's throw away that layer because dissolve mode is the mode that I use the least, and I bet you most other people use it the least. So let's not waste too much time. The main time I might want to use it is if I add a drop shadow or a glow behind something and I want it to have a different look. I could make it have that dissolved look. Now here we have all these other blending modes, and you'll notice that they're divided up into sections. Do you see the horizontal lines that divide them up into sections? And that's because each blending mode that is contained within a particular section has some common qualities. And if you learn what those common qualities are, then it's not necessarily important that you understand exactly what every single mode does. If you mainly understand what's common about all of the modes in there, you know enough to be able to use them. And so let's take a look. This section in here are known as the darken modes because they're only able to darken your picture. You won't find your picture getting brighter when you use any of these. So let's see when we might be able to use that. In this particular photograph here, I took this in Iceland. And in Iceland, there are some volcanic areas and some just geothermal things where there can be steam coming out of the ground. And what I did is I took more than one photograph here, so that steam moved into different locations in each shot. What I want to do is reduce the amount of steam showing up. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to have Photoshop compare these layers. And if you were to look at this particular layer and compare it to this one, and say, where is this top layer darker than the layer that's underneath? Well, if you look, let's say right here, do you see this spot here? We're on the bottom, on the top layer. I might actually reverse these to make it true what I'm just saying here. Look right here. Do you see some steam in that area? And if you compare that to the layer above, there is no steam. I'm going to tell it to compare these two layers and only take the parts of the layer above that are darker than what's underneath. And if anything in the layer above is brighter than what's underneath, just make it disappear. So the only parts that show up are what's darker than what's underneath. And I do that by simply changing this menu to the mode called Darken. And watch that section, and we'll see if I turn this layer off and on, aren't we reducing the amount of steam in that area? Now I'm going to go to the next layer up, and here, do you see this whole area over in this section where we have steam? But when I turn on the layer above, there's no steam there, right? Doesn't that make this darker because the steam was lighting it up? So I'm going to set this layer also to darken mode, so it only uses the areas that are darker than what's underneath. And when I do, that's going to help us further reduce the steam that was there. I'll go to the next layer up, and all I'm going to do is repeat the process over and over again. And I don't know that I took enough photographs to completely get rid of the steam, but I should have taken enough here to reduce it quite a bit. So let's compare what it looks like with only one photograph in here. See all that steam? And then let's see how much of the steam we were able to reduce by putting each one of these layers above in darken mode. See that? Now, if I was patient enough, and maybe I sat there for another 5 minutes or something, the wind might have changed directions a little bit, and I might have been able to get it so this portion in here also didn't have steam in a shot. The steam might have been going straight up because the wind changed. And therefore, I'd be able to do it with enough shots where the steam could completely disappear. I just need more patience to take the shots. Does that make sense? I'm going to close these. apply to all. So I had more than one picture open there. And so that's why it would possibly take multiple shots. You could do this at Yellowstone National Park. They have those, big pools of water with a really cool, colorful growth in it. But all the steam is blocking your view of what's really in there. You just need the patience to wait until the wind changes enough different directions where you can capture it with the steam going different ways. You might be able to completely get rid of that. It'd be pretty cool. Let's see about doing the opposite. Here I have a picture of some lightning. And I have another picture of some lightning taken in the same location. I'm going to combine these two images together. I'm just going to use my Move tool. I'll drag it over to the other file, drag down. And I notice that the bottom of the image, you see it shifting when I hide this layer? Just the tree line is changing. I'm not sure if Photoshop will be good at this because of how dark it is and how the lightning changes in position, but I'm going to just try it. I'll select both layers and choose Auto Align Layers. And I think we used that once before when we worked with some taxis driving across a road. And here it says it can't quite do it, so what I might have to do is manually move them. We'll manually move them in a moment. But what I want to do is primarily get it so that this lightning and this lightning show up at the same time, to make it look as if the storm was more fierce than it really was. Well, how can I do that? Why can't I use the opposite of darken mode? There's a mode in here, right here, called lighten, where all it does is say, let's use the parts of this layer that are brighter than what's underneath. And so if you look at this picture, what's going to be brighter than what's underneath? Well, definitely where the lightning is, right? And let's set it to lighten mode, and now suddenly we see both streaks of lightning. See that? And the only thing is down here where the tree line is, I can see kind of a double image because the sky doesn't quite align. I can always use my Move tool and kind of arrow this around until it manually lines up, or I could use a layer mask and just kind of paint that out so that we don't see that edge. So I can take as many of these photographs of lightning as I want. Here we got a nice little strike coming down. I'll open that up. All I'm doing is dragging it over to the other file that contains the layers. Here we are. And I'm going to set it again to lighten mode. And so now let's turn those off and see how it builds up. Here's 1, 2, 3. Okay? This could also be fireworks. In fact, fireworks are great because oftentimes I can shoot fireworks in isolation, where all I have is a black sky with fireworks. Because I can point my camera up, and there's not going to be a building or anything within that view because the fireworks are up so high in the sky. But then I can take that picture of fireworks, and I can drag it on top of a wider angle view of a city, let's say. I put it on top of it and set it to lighten mode. And I'm going to keep those fireworks because the fireworks will be brighter than whatever sky was in the original image, and combine it, similar to what I've done here. And in fact, here's some fireworks. See that? Now, the key to making this work, though, is if you want to put the fireworks in another photograph, is we just need to make sure that the sky that's out here is darker than the sky of the photo you're going to put it into. Because if it's in a mode called lighten mode, and that sky's brighter than the sky of the photo you plan to put it in, it would still show up. But what's nice is you could always adjust this. I'd usually adjust it with levels, and I would just bring in the slider that forces areas to black and say, make that sky black. And then it'll definitely be darker than a background. So let's see, if you want to see, here I have a skyline. That's Seattle. But it was a boring night. There was no fireworks. So let's go find some fireworks. I'm going to take these fireworks, and these extra lights down here I don't need, so we'll mask them out when we're done. But I'm just going to use the Move tool. I'm going to drag this up, drag it over here into this image. Fireworks are a little on the large side, so let's scale them down. I'm going to type Command-T. Remember, that's a shortcut for Free Transform. We use it all this month, so you should get used to it. Command-T. And since this image is so big, I can't see the little transformation handles that would usually be on the corners. And I've mentioned before that you could go to the View menu, and there was a choice called Fit on Screen. Keyboard shortcut is Command-0. And when you're transforming something, that makes the transformation handles fit on screen. So I'll bring this down, move it in here, Command-0 again. And I probably want that to be relatively small compared to the skyline. And then I'm just going to set this particular layer to lighten mode. And then only the areas that are brighter than what's underneath will show up. Anything that's darker than what's underneath will completely disappear. So if you look at the sky on the fireworks, isn't it darker than the sky that's behind it? Just by glancing, you can tell. So therefore, when I'm in lighten mode, it should just go away. And then I can zoom up on this. And you can see our fireworks. Now, if the sky with the fireworks was not darker than what's behind it, like there's a twilight sky, it was kind of blue in the sky, but the one I'm putting it on is a black sky, then what I would need to do is adjust this layer. I would just go to Image, Adjustments, Levels. And in Levels, the slider on the upper left forces areas to black. I would pull this in until the entire sky turned black, because then it would definitely be darker than what's underneath, and suddenly it would just disappear because we're in lighten mode. But in this case, I don't think that's necessary. The only thing is if I move this layer, do you see the lights at the bottom are in there? And so what I would end up doing is I would add a layer mask. So at the bottom, we have the layer mask icon. We had a whole separate session on layer mask. I click that, I grab my brush, and I paint with black. If I paint with black, I can hide anything in that layer, and I'll hide any of those extra lights that are down there at the bottom. I'll just turn this layer off and on to make sure I got all of the extra lights. Looks to me like I did. And then I can scale and position this wherever I'd like to. Right now it's still on the large side, but you get the idea, right? So lightning, fireworks, works great. That lightning shot, remember how blue the sky was? That blue sky would be brighter than this sky. So if I put it in there in lighten mode, I'd still see that blue sky showing up in there. So I'd adjust it with levels. Just bring in that slider that forces things to black until the area around the lightning goes dark, where it's dark enough where it disappears. And we can easily put lightning in there too. We can make it ridiculous, lightning all over Seattle. So then let's look at some of the other modes that are in there. I'll open this guy. I'm going to work on the layer that's on top. This is an image that my brother created. My brother creates lamps. And he made a 3D model of one of his lamps before he actually constructed it to see if it's something he'd like to actually make. And in the 3D software, he was able to get the glass of the bulb to show up here. But then he also rendered the little filaments lit up. And for some reason, they wouldn't show up when he turned on that feature in his 3D software. And the only way he can get it to show up is to turn off the glass of the bulbs. For some reason, he couldn't get the filament and the glass at the same time. The 3D software just wouldn't work that way. So he wanted to know if I could fix it somehow. So I said, well, can you save it as 2 different pictures? One that shows the filaments, one that shows the glass. And I said, sure, we can fix that in Photoshop in a few seconds. This is an example that connects with you, because when would you ever need to do this? Just think about taking pictures of stereo equipment. Let's say you're hired to take pictures of some stereo gear, and it's going to be used in a catalog. You're getting paid to shoot it. And you take a picture of the stereo gear with great studio lighting where it's really nice. The highlights and everything on the stereo gear look great, but the little display on the stereo gear is so dark that you doesn't pick up. So why not take 2 pictures? Why not turn all your studio lights off so you have a pitch dark room? Take a picture where all you're getting is the little digital display on the unit. Expose for it so it looks perfect. Get it just the right brightness. The rest of the scene is black because the lights are turned off. Then you take a second picture with all your studio strobes turned on where you got a great shot of your stereo gear, but you just can barely see those readouts. And put one right on top of the other. And you're going to do the equivalent to what I do here. Okay? So I'm going to take this top layer, and I could set it to lighten mode. And if I did, it's only going to take the parts that are brighter than what's underneath and keep them. And these filaments should, for the most part, be brighter than the glass that's underneath. So I'll try lighten mode. All right. Now there is another choice in here we could use as well, and it's called screen mode. I didn't name these. I would have used different names, but lighten mode is a pretty good name because it is relatively literal. Show me only what's lighter in this layer than what's underneath. But screen mode acts like light. Screen mode says, let's add the amount of light that's in this layer to the amount of light that's on the layer above. As if like you did a double exposure on your camera, where however much light is in one is just added to the other. So if I choose screen mode, those filaments will probably get brighter. And the only problem is that the middle of the model in here also gets brighter. And that's because we're doubling up the amount of light that's there, because we had that in both of the layers. So what I could do if I wanted it to only be where the filaments are is I would add a mask. If I add a mask, I don't know if you remember or not, but when you click the layer mask icon, usually you get a white mask. And there was a trick if you wanted to get a mask that starts out with black. And a black mask would hide the entirety of the layer. And that was you hold down the Option key, Alt in Windows, when you click the layer mask icon. So I'll do that. And now I'm going to paint with white only where the filament should come in. And therefore, the middle part of the model won't get too bright, because we're not applying it in screen mode in those areas. But this could just as easily be stereo gear with the little LED lights and the displays and all that. So if you want to see the difference, I can switch between screen mode and lighten mode. Screen mode will almost always produce a brighter result. Sometimes it'll be the same, but otherwise it'll usually be brighter. So here's lighten, and here's screen. So very similar concept. So isn't it nice that they grouped them together, because they give you very similar end results? So if you remember back to our lightning shots, if I were to use it with the lightning shots, see if I can go find them here. Since there's a blue sky in the lightning shots, that blue sky, the light that's in it, in screen mode is going to get kind of doubled up, because it's in lighten mode, we're only getting the areas that are brighter than what's underneath. In screen mode, it adds the amount of light that's in each layer together. And so you see how much brighter the sky got? And so it always gives you a brighter result. And here I'd have to mask it or be more precise with my alignment on where the trees are. So all that means is anytime you might consider using lighten mode, you probably also want to try screen. Or at least if lighten mode gives you too dark of an end result, then go for screen. Let's see what else. Let's use a special mode that combines lighten mode. It actually combines screen mode and its opposite to see what we can do. I'm going to open an image, and if we create a simple layer, I'll create a brand new empty layer, and in that layer I'm going to put a gradient. This is not that you need to create a gradient, this is just to show you a general concept, and then we'll actually figure out a good use for this. So first I'm going to come in here and show you screen mode. That's going to add the amount of light that's in this layer to the amount of light that would be used to make what's underneath. So there's no light whatsoever over here, so we'll see the original picture that's underneath in that area. And then the original picture will be getting brighter and brighter and brighter as it goes across here, because it's going to add all of this light to what's underneath. That's screen mode. So you see how it's getting brighter as it goes towards the right. Now, there is an opposite of screen mode. I think of screen mode as adding the amount of light in each layer. The opposite is called multiply mode. I didn't name them. I wouldn't have called it multiply. Multiply mode acts like ink. So imagine this is made out of ink. You're going to print it on an inkjet printer, for instance. How much ink would be put down over here on the right side? None. You'd just leave the sheet of paper alone, wouldn't you? And then here you'd add a little bit of ink. And in multiply mode, it's like printing two images on top of each other with an inkjet. Print one on the sheet of paper, send the paper back through the printer again, and print another picture right on top of it. And so that means that here we'd add more and more and more ink. That would darken and darken the picture. Once we get over here, we're going to add as much black ink as we can, and it's going to make the image black. But that's multiply mode. Multiply mode, what could we use it for? Well, what if somebody has a tattoo? And I want to transplant that tattoo from them to somebody else. Well, I could select the tattoo, put it on its own layer, and go drag it on top of another picture. But if I chose multiply mode, I'd have a problem. And that is the skin that is also within that tattoo, when you choose multiply mode, would double up with the skin on the layer below. So all I would do is adjust it with levels. There's a slider in levels that forces areas to white. I would pull it over until the skin disappeared and turned solid white. You can do that. And then multiply mode to be able to transplant that. But in this case, we're going to use a filter instead of a tattoo. I'm going to duplicate this layer. To duplicate a layer, you can go to the Layer menu and choose Duplicate Layer. I don't use that command, though, because there are no keyboard shortcuts. If there was, it would be listed on the right side. There's another command that does, in general, the same thing, but does have a keyboard shortcut, and that's the main reason I use it. And that is right here is a choice called Layer via Copy. And you see the keyboard shortcut? Command J, and I can remember that if I think of jumping something to a new layer. So because it's something I use so often, I use it every day, I like to get the version that has a keyboard shortcut. I'm going to type Command J, and when I do, watch my Layers panel. See how it just duplicated the layer? So Command J to duplicate. I'm going to apply a filter to this. The filter I'm going to use is called Find Edges. That's going to try to find the edges of everything in my picture and draw a black line around them. Well, what if I were to send this through an inkjet printer and print it? How much ink would be put down right in this area up here? None, right? And only where these lines are would it need to put any ink down. Well, then what if I already printed that on my inkjet printer and I sent it through the printer a second time? And on the second pass, I printed this. Well, then wouldn't it just print those lines on top of this thing? That would be the end result, the look of it. Well, let's see if we can do that. I'm going to change the blending mode of this to multiply. And when I do, all the areas that are white should disappear, because when you print with ink, how do you print white? You just don't put any ink down, right? So multiply mode. I'll turn this layer off and on, and let's see if it's doing anything. Yeah. You see those little highlights on everything as far as the dark lines go? That's all the dark lines from this top layer. If I set it back to normal, printed on top of that image as if we're using ink. And with ink, the white areas, you don't print any ink. So that won't change the image. So that's multiply mode. Okay? Or it could be a tattoo you copied from somebody, or it could be your logo you scanned in. And the white sheet of paper is in the scan too. Set it to multiply mode. What happens to the white sheet of paper? It disappears, because how much ink would you use to print a white sheet of paper? None, as long as it's bright enough to truly be white. So we have that. Now let's try and find out about some other blending modes. There is the next section of blending modes down here. And these are all interesting because they combine a blending mode from this section with a blending mode from this section. So let's see what we can do there. I'm going to go back to having our simple image where I put a gradient on a layer. And I'll just remind you of what multiply mode would look like. Remember, that's like ink. See how the left side's dark? What screen mode would look like, that's like light. And now let's combine those two together. That's one called hard light. I didn't name them. I would have used other names, but hard light is combining multiply and screen together. You see how the one side that was being lightened before still is, and the other side that was being darkened before still is. So the way this works is 50% gray goes away. Anything that's lighter than 50% gray acts like it's in screen mode, which means acts like it's using light. Anything darker than 50% gray acts like it's in multiply mode, which means it acts like ink. So it's kind of weird. So let's try to figure out a use for this. Well, this time I'm going to duplicate that layer, Command-J, and I'm going to use a filter again. We have a whole session on filters, so we'll get into them in more detail, but I'm going to use one here called Emboss. That's filter stylize, Emboss. And I'm doing it to a copy of the layer, so we still have the original underneath. When I choose Emboss, do you notice the vast majority of the image looks gray? In fact, these areas out here, they're exactly 50% gray. Just happens to be how that filter works, where pretty much 98% of your image will be 50% gray when you're done using it. And then a few areas where it finds the edges of objects will be brightened or darkened. Well, in this mode down here called hard light, doesn't 50% gray just go away? And if so, wouldn't all that gray go away? In areas darker than 50% gray, darken the picture as if they're using ink. So that means it's going to print all the little darker areas on top of what's underneath. And areas brighter than 50% gray act like light. And so those areas you can see that are a little brighter, they'll just brighten up the picture. So if I set this to hard light mode, now let's zoom up on it so I can see the detail. And I'll toggle this layer off and on. See how it's applying that kind of embossed look. I would have probably used lower settings if I was zoomed up. When we were zoomed out, I was using kind of crude settings. But I can actually get the look of that embossing without all the gray. And there are many other filters that will produce 50% gray that whenever I see that, I apply a filter and suddenly it looks 50% gray. I'm going to end up probably heading over to those blending modes that are in that grouping. So let's try something else. Let's go and find a texture. This could be handmade paper you took a picture of. This could be the texture of a stucco wall. It could be any kind of texture where it doesn't vary in brightness dramatically. It's just somewhat subtle. I'm going to take that and drag it on top of my picture. Not sure if it's big enough. No, it's not. But I'll zoom up, and we can at least look at the area that it covers. Now, what if I took this layer, and I may have already done it, but I adjust it with levels? And in levels, when I talked about basic tonal adjustments, I doubt you remember, but I described the middle slider that's in levels. And the way I described it is I said it takes whatever shade is directly below it and makes it 50% gray. And so if you move it like this so that you have an area that used to be really dark and now you're making it 50% gray, that would brighten up your picture. And if you moved it like this, then areas that used to be really bright, like this bright, would become 50% gray. Then we have a bar chart here that tells us which of these shades are used in our picture. And if you pick any shade of gray from down here and go straight up, if there's a bar in the bar chart, it's in your picture. If there's not, like over here, it's nowhere to be found. And the height of the bar tells you how much space each one takes up. So the highest ones right there is whatever takes up the most space. Whatever brightness level takes up the most space in here. I'm going to take this slider and move it right to the middle of that hump. And that's going to take whatever part of this texture takes up the most space, whatever brightness level is in there that takes up the most, and make it 50% gray. Now, if I set this menu to hard light mode, all the areas that are 50% gray, which should be the majority of this texture, will just disappear. Any area that happens to be brighter than 50% gray will brighten the image, as if it's using light to do so. Any area that's darker than 50% gray will darken the image. And so when I set it to hard light mode, you can see the texture being applied right to my picture. The main thing I needed to do, though, is to ensure that the texture's overall brightness is close to 50% gray, so that the majority of the texture just disappears as far as you can see through it. If the texture was very dark, it would be darkening the image a lot. If the texture was very bright, it'd be brightening the image very much. But if the overall brightness of the texture is right around 50% gray, then the overall image that's underneath won't change much in brightness. It's only where the little shadows and highlights and things are in the texture that will cause you to do that. Doesn't that look pretty cool? So we can do that. Anytime you scan a texture, just put it on its own layer. You'll want to adjust it with levels. Usually with textures, you'll find one huge hump in levels. Move the middle slider until it's right in the center of it. That makes it so it's around 50% gray. The other thing you'll want to do is choose image, let's see, adjustments, and there's a choice in here called desaturate. That means pull all the color out of your texture. Otherwise, if you have a yellow texture, your picture will become all yellow at the same time. But if we choose desaturate it, it'll make it so your texture is grayscale. It's black and white. And therefore, the color of the underlying image will not shift. So now we've explored a few of the blending modes in this top section, a few of the blending modes in the next section down, and at least one of the blending modes here. So let's revisit the fact that these are divided up into sections. And why? Well, these are all put together because they're only capable of darkening your picture. And with all of them, there is one particular thing that just disappears. If you're in multiply mode, where you're acting like you're using ink, there's one particular color that just disappears. What color, when you try to print it on an inkjet printer, does it not need any ink to print? White, right? So with all of these modes up here, white will simply disappear. And in Photoshop terminology, it's known as being neutral. And so that means white is neutral, meaning it doesn't affect things in all of these modes. And they're only capable of darkening. So anytime I see a huge amount of white that I don't want, I'm thinking about going to any one of these modes. And if I'm going to try one mode, like darken mode, there's darken mode, I'm going to also try multiply. And I'm also going to try color burn. And I'm also going to try linear burn. And I'm also going to try darker color. And each one will give me a variation on that theme. With these modes here, remember screen mode acts like light. Well, there's one particular color where you need no light to reproduce it. What's the absence of light? Blackness, isn't it? So with all of these modes, black simply disappears. And the things that are brighter than black have the potential of brightening your photograph. So if I'm going to try lighten mode, I'm also going to try screen mode. I'm also going to try color dodge. And I'm also going to try linear dodge and lighter color. They'll all give me variations on the same theme. We don't have to know exactly the differences in every single one. We just need to know what makes them all common. Because then that's what sends me to a particular section of modes that I want to explore. Then these modes down here, almost all of them are a combination of the modes up here in this section and the modes down here in this section. And there's one particular color that is neutral, meaning it disappears in there. And I think we learned what it was. And that is if white disappears in one mode and black disappears in the other mode, if you mix black and white together equally, you get gray, 50% gray. So in all of these modes, 50% gray goes away. In things brighter than 50% gray have the potential of brightening. Things darker than 50% gray have the potential of darkening. So if I'm going to try hard light mode and I don't like the end result, then I'll probably try overlay. And then I'll probably try soft light. And then I might try vivid light to see if one of these will give me a result I like. If the result is too strong, I like it, but it's just a bit too strong. You always have opacity at the top of your layers panel. I just click on the word opacity and I start dragging to the left, and I can lessen the impact of this. Okay? If it's not enough, Maybe I come in here and with overlay mode, it's too subtle. Well, consider typing Command J to duplicate the layer. You just doubled it up, applying it twice strength. And if that's too much, lower the opacity. You get the idea, though. If it's not enough, just duplicate the layer multiple times until it is enough. And if it's too much, then lower the opacity to lessen it. And so hard light mode is a combination of multiply and screen. And these others are combinations of what's up here. So like linear light might be a combination of linear burn and linear dodge, that kind of thing. It's just at 50% gray is the cutoff of when is it acting like one or the other. Now we have another section down here. These are what I call comparative modes. If you want to know what I call these sections, these are the darken modes, because that's all they can do. These are the lighten modes, because that's all they can do. These are what I call the contrast modes, because if they both brighten and darken, when it does that, the contrast goes up in your picture. So these are the contrast modes. These are what I call the comparative modes. Not that that means anything to you yet, but let's see if we can figure out what is going on with it. What do I feel like using? This is a texture I created. And I want to find out the smallest area where the texture repeats. Because there's a feature in Photoshop where you can define something as a pattern. And if you do, all it does is tile that image over and over again. So if I can find the smallest section of this that could be used to repeat, where it's absolutely identical to what's to the right of it, could be useful. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select a vertical area, and I'm going to copy it to its own layer. So watch my layers panel. I'll type Command J, and you see that little part. If I were to hide the layer that's underneath, that's what's on the top layer. Then I'm going to change this blending mode to a choice called Difference. And it's going to show me where the layer I'm working on looks different than what's underneath. Wherever it's black, it's identical to what's underneath. If I use my Move tool and start to reposition this, do you see how I no longer see black everywhere? Now, wherever it's not black, it's different than what's underneath. So what if I were to move this so it's black? And I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but you can turn on rulers. And when your rulers are visible, you can click on a ruler and pull out a guide. And they snap to things. I'll just snap it right there. So I simply remember where were we when it lined up with what's underneath. So I went to the View menu to get to my rulers. And I just clicked right on the ruler and dragged into the image to get a guide. Now I'm going to use the arrow keys on my keyboard to nudge this over to the right. And I'm just going to keep nudging it until it turns black again. And when it turns black again, that means it should perfectly line up with what's underneath. Does that make sense? So now if I pull out another guide and have it snap to that same edge, we should know that's the width that we need to have it repeat. I want to do the same thing vertically, so I'm going to pull out a guide from the top ruler, get it on the top of this thing, and then I'll use the down arrow key to nudge it down until it turns black again. When it turns black again, it should be lining up with what's underneath it. There. Then I'll just pull out another guide to snap it to the edge. Finally, I'll throw away that top layer because it's served its purpose. And I'll hide my rulers. Right there is the smallest area I could use that could repeat over and over if you just tiled it. I mean, if you look at it, here right where the line is, do you see how it cut off this little piece right here? Well, do you see that little piece sitting right here within that tile? And here you see how it cut off the bottom of that thing? Well, right up there is the bottom. So you could take this and repeat it over and over again, and it would be a seamless texture. So I'm going to select this, or a pattern I should call it. If I just do this, it should snap to the guides. I'm making a selection with the marquee tool. And I can choose Edit, Define Pattern. And that means store what I currently have selected so I can use it again. And I'm just going to call it Dimples. Dumples. Sometimes typos are fun. And now let's see if it would work. I'll create a brand new document. I don't really care the size. And then I'm going to choose Edit, Fill. And one of the choices when you fill is to fill with a pattern. So edit fill is how I got to this pattern. And the very last pattern in the list is the one I created. And so there. Now I can use those dimples anytime I want. But do you see how using the comparative modes was helpful there? That could also be helpful if I had two images. Do you remember when I had the lightning images? And I was trying to get it so the little tree line lined up? Well, I was just doing it kind of willy-nilly, where it's like I'm eyeballing it. If I set it to difference mode, I would move it until it gets as close to black as I possibly could, which means it's as similar to what's underneath as I could, and it would have been more aligned. So remember, that was all of these modes in here. Compare two layers, the layer you're working on to whatever's underneath, and shows you where they're different. And those aren't as useful as like on a daily basis kind of thing, but I'm really happy they're there because they can make things, you know, if I had two identical pictures here and they didn't quite line up, set this to difference mode, and it would tell me, yeah, they don't line up. And then I arrow this around, arrow this down. There, now they perfectly line up. Now, if these two images were not absolutely identical, because it's more like a panorama that I had stitched, and the second image might be slightly rotated or something like that, I could still move this around, and it just would never turn black. I would move it until it gets as dark as I can. And then I'd know it's as close to lining up as I can get it. All right, then we have another section of modes in here down below. And these are the HSL modes. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminosity. Because what these modes do is they divide your picture up into three different components. Those components are called hue, saturation, and luminosity. And if you're not familiar with those terms by chance, hue means basic color. Is it red, green, yellow, orange? Well, you ignore other qualities, like how much of that color is in there. Like, is it a vivid red or is it barely red at all? And it ignores, is it a bright red or a dark red? It just means basically what color is in there while ignoring the brightness and while ignoring how colorful it is. That's hue. It means basic color. Saturation means how colorful is it? Is it a vivid red or is it almost black and white where it's just the tiniest hint of red? And then luminosity is just another word for brightness. And that means how bright or dark is it. And so these modes will divide your image up into those three qualities, hue, saturation, and brightness or luminosity, and allow you to apply just some parts of that. So if you look at this particular picture here, I have a new layer sitting on top of it. I'm going to just choose a color by clicking on my foreground color, grab whatever I want, and I'm going to paint on top of this. And imagine I was precise. Not going to be. All right, then I come up here and I say, let's do luminosity. That means take the brightness of this layer and apply it to the hue that's underneath, meaning the basic color that's down there, and the saturation that's underneath, which means however colorful the stuff is down there, make this stuff just as colorful. It's not going to look very good, I don't think. That's weird. That just evened out kind of the brightness of the car a lot. That's not very useful. I'll show you when it is useful. In fact, let me see if I can find a, hopefully I have it. Yeah, no? Well, I'll have to create something because I don't have the image. Let's say I did something like in here, I went in and I applied a curves adjustment layer. And I brought out contrast within this image. I came in and decided to click on a few areas and I started darkening like this. Do you see how the image is becoming more colorful when I do that? If I turn this off and on, didn't it become more vivid? Well, why not take the blending mode for this adjustment layer and set it to luminosity? And what that means is only let this affect the brightness of what's under it. Don't let it affect the hue or the saturation. So when I set it to luminosity, do you see the mellow color comes back in? So now if I turn this off and on, I'm darkening like I wanted to, but I'm not getting the color changes. So anytime you do any kind of an adjustment and you mean to change the brightness of your picture, but for some reason Photoshop ends up changing the color, change the blending mode of that particular adjustment layer to luminosity. Let's try the other choices. If I set this to hue, it means take the basic color of this layer and apply it to the brightness that's underneath and make it just as saturated as what's underneath. Because it divides it up into 3 sections, hue, saturation, and luminosity, and we're saying only apply one of those and therefore get the other 2 pieces from what's underneath. You need all 3 pieces to define something. So here's hue. Check it out. We got a blue car. Continue to paint in here. So if you have something that is already colorful and you want to change what color it is, then you want to use hue mode. Hue means change basic color, but leave it how colorful it used to be. And that's why the shadows in here that don't contain very much color still don't contain very much color. And this is also going to keep the brightness the same as it used to be. We're only applying the hue, which is the basic color. Now let's say that we didn't have any color. Maybe this image I chose black and white. Let me just brighten it up a little bit. So we didn't have any color, and I want to add some. So I'm going to create a new layer to put my color on, and I'm going to paint on that layer. And then we have to think about what mode we'd need to use. Now, hue mode is not going to work. Because remember, this divides your image up into 3 parts, hue, saturation, and I'll just call it brightness. You need all 3 parts of those to define something. And right now, all we have on the layer underneath is brightness. There is no color at all, right? So if we apply hue, it disappears because it doesn't know how colorful it should be. There's no color underneath. When we use hue, it keeps the image as colorful as it used to be underneath. And so therefore, there is no color. It just doesn't do a thing. We need to instead use a mode called color. Color is 2 pieces. Color means apply both the hue, which is our basic color, and the saturation together. And just use the brightness of what's underneath. So when I set it to color, there, now we're starting to get the color in there. I might need to adjust the darkness of the car to get the blue to look appropriate, but that's how we can try to colorize a black and white picture. One method is to use color mode. Now there is a problem using color mode, and that is it's going to make the image underneath just as saturated as the color you painted with. And if we were to look at the original, I'll revert this back to the original. Do you notice that in the dark parts of the car, like on the dark part of the hood up here, it's not as colorful as in the bright parts, like down here? And if you look in the really dark part, like right there where that shadow is hitting the car, there's almost no color at all. But when I use the mode called color, it forces the same amount of color, the same saturation level throughout, and so that's going to look very false. It's not going to look realistic. When we have a session that is called advanced layers, we'll learn how to fix that. We'll learn how to say, apply it less when you get into the dark parts, but we just don't know how to do that yet. But the main thing is, if an image doesn't have any color to begin with, hue won't do anything at all. Because hue means only change the basic color of what's underneath. Leave it just as colorful as it used to be. So if it's black and white underneath, It's going to be just as colorful as it used to be. It's still going to be black and white. If there was the tiniest hint of color in that image underneath, we would have the tiniest hint of whatever color is on the layer we painted with when we use hue mode. When we use color mode, it applies both hue and saturation, meaning both the basic color that's in that layer and how colorful it is. And so that's what we need when we're trying to colorize things. The color mode is also useful when you make adjustments. If you make an adjustment, and let's say what we're doing is some sort of color correction. I'm going to do a curves adjustment layer, and we haven't talked about color much, so I'm just going to do something without telling you how, and come in here and see if I can get this to change the colors in my image a bit. Okay, the color shifted. Let's say that's what I was going for, is the color shifting. But as a consequence of having the color shift, the brightness got out of whack. Well, I could take this adjustment layer and change its blending mode to a choice called color. And that means allow this layer to only affect the basic color, so it can shift around the basic color. Allow it also to control how colorful the picture is, but do not let it control what's known as the luminosity. Don't let it change the brightness. That's what color mode will do when it comes to an adjustment layer. So if you're ever adjusting a picture and you're trying to shift the color, and as a consequence of trying to shift the color, the brightness happens to change in an undesirable way, change the mode to color. And now, if I turn this off and on, you can see the color shifting around, but the brightness is largely staying the same, if it's at all possible to. So we see our blending modes. The one called saturation is not very useful. It means make the image underneath just as colorful as what I paint with. Leave the color the same as what it used to be. Leave the brightness the same as what it used to be. But just make it as colorful as the color I'm painting with. And the problem with that is you paint with vivid blue and everything changes to a vivid color, and it doesn't look right all that much. I mean, the one thing you could do with it is if you painted with a shade of gray, doesn't matter which shade of gray, then it's going to make it just as colorful as that shade of gray. There is no color in grays. So that would make things black and white as you paint over them. But there are other ways of doing that, and so I don't get too excited about it. Then I could always lower the opacity of that to say, don't apply it all the way. Let some of the original show through. And so that can be like a toned down amount of color. So hopefully this is giving you some sense for this menu called blending modes. Remember that things are broken up into sections. These are the darken modes. And they can only darken, and white disappears. These can only brighten. They're lighten modes. And in them, black disappears. These are the contrast modes because they both brighten and darken. And in those, 50% gray goes away. These are the comparative modes, where it compares one layer to what's underneath, shows you where they're different, and it just does it in slightly different ways. And these modes here divide your image up into three parts: hue, saturation, and luminosity, and allows you to apply just one of those qualities, or in the case of color, two of those qualities, from the layer you're working on, so that the other categories are taken from what's underneath. And this can also be used in painting tools. If I grab a painting tool, you'll find it up here. And now it means, how is this painting tool going to interact with the one layer I'm painting on? Just as if it was on a separate layer above, but instead we're painting directly on the layer. And there are some very useful things you could do there. For instance, when you're working on masks, let's say this was in a layer mask. And in that layer mask, I want to paint with this shade of gray right here. And I want to paint right across here. But I don't want it to replace what was already there.
I want the areas that are white to become that, and the areas that are black stay the way they are. Well, how do you do that? Well, this shade of gray, isn't it brighter than what's underneath? What if I tell it with this little menu up here for my paintbrush tool to only darken things? If all it's capable of doing is darkening, then this shade can't change the black because it's not darker than black. So when I set it to that, now look, cool. Okay. So they're useful for all sorts of things. And so the more time you spend with them, I mean, it's over years and years of time. You get a little inventory of tricks in your head that make them more and more useful. I just hope here we gave you an introduction to them where now you're not afraid of the menu and you're like, oh, I got to start playing with that. And then over the next 10 years you play with Photoshop, you'll start using them a lot more and getting a much more crystallized idea of how to think about them. Okay. Question?
Is there a trick to like kind of scroll through all of them?
Yeah, there is a trick to scroll through all of them. If you have whatever you want on its own layer and the Move tool is active, then you can, at least on a Macintosh, you can hold down the Shift key and hit plus or minus on your keyboard. And if you do, it'll actually cycle through that menu, switching down it one at a time each time you hit the key. So Shift, either plus or minus. I can't remember if plus goes up or down in the list, but it's one direction or the other. And you have to be in the Move tool. In Windows, I don't think it does it quite that way because in Windows, if you just click on the menu itself, then you can use the arrow keys to cycle through what's there, I think. That Shift plus minus is working? Okay, so it does work in Windows as well. All right, so that's it for today. Let's talk about Monday. Monday, we're going to experiment with filters. And I bet you when we get into filters, we're probably going to be using blending modes along with them because you saw how useful, we used what, Find Edges before, we used Emboss. There's a bunch of other filters where when you combine them with blending modes, they become more useful. And we're going to explore that whole menu and see what we can do with it. But between now and then, why don't you head over to the Facebook group? The Facebook group is where you can ask questions, where you can comment about what you've done. You can upload your own images to say, hey, look what I just did. You know, I took these fireworks and I put them on top of this, different image, that kind of stuff. And if you haven't been to the Facebook group yet, this is the website you can go to right at the bottom. You have to ask to be part of the group. That's because it's a closed group. We'll let you in if you just send a request there. And the reason it's a closed group is so that your general followers can't read what you post in there. So if you post in there something about, I hate this client. They keep asking me to do so-and-so. Is there any way I can fix it? That client's not going to read that comment unless they choose to become part of this group. So that's why we closed the group. If you want to find me on the web, here are various sources from my website to Pinterest to Instagram. But otherwise, this is another day in Photoshop CC, the complete guide. I hope to see you next time.